Pay close attention to what I'm about to tell you, because your financial future depends on every word of this message. Immediately discard the comforting illusion that this video is just another sensationalist speculation, an unfounded conspiracy theory, or cheap clickbait designed to generate fleeting panic. What you are about to witness is the anatomy of a silent and irreversible financial implosion, a true systemic trap that has already been activated deep within the government bureaucracy and that the market has not yet fully grasped, while the vast majority of the population remains hypnotized by shallow narratives of war anxiety and false hopes of economic recovery. The very foundation of institutional trust that underpins the global financial system has begun to crumble terminally. Liquidity is not just migrating. It is about to suffer an unprecedented, catastrophic evaporation. The clock of this systemic crisis undeniably began ticking on February 20th, 2026, a date that will forever be remembered for the destruction of the predictability of global trade. In a 6-3 decision, the United States Supreme Court invalidated the president's use of the IEEPA law, overturning the existing tariff regime and breaking the legal foundation of all recent economic policy. This is not a simple political defeat for the executive branch. It is a gigantic structural fracture in the mechanics that maintain the dominance of the American currency. This judicial decision suddenly inserted a potential $175 billion hole in the American Treasury, related to retroactive reimbursements owed to importers. In a scenario where the deficit is already absolutely $1 trillion and unsustainable in the long term, radically weakening the capacity of the central state. Naturally, you're about to hear exactly what the cowardly mainstream media refuses to report with due gravity. They are too busy hiding the real bureaucratic panic. Hours after the humiliation in court, the government triggered an obscure 1974 law, known as Section 122 of the Trade Act, designed exclusively for extreme balance of payments crises. This desperate measure reimposed 15% tariffs, but it carries with it a built-in death spiral. The decree mathematically expires in exactly 150 days without congressional intervention. The armed dollar mechanism has lost its permanent institutional credibility and has been replaced by an unpredictable timer with a legal expiration date. We are witnessing the conversion of global security into a ticking time bomb whose hands are moving mercilessly toward the inevitable economic precipice. The fundamental cog that has just broken in the engine of the global economy is called unilateral executive authority. For decades, you have been conditioned to believe in a comforting illusion that the government possesses absolute control over the levers of commercial and financial power. This false security, perceived by the public, is nothing more than an elaborate charade to hide the cracks in the monetary dam. When the Supreme Court removed the president's ability to use IEEPA, it deactivated the emergency brake of the American financial system. Imagine a bullet train loaded with explosives descending a steep mountain, where the engineer suddenly realizes that the controls on the main panel have been permanently disconnected. The fiat market operates under exactly this same illusory dynamic, completely ignoring that the main plumbing of state economic policy has just become irreparably and catastrophically clogged. To understand the magnitude of this death spiral, we need to look at the retroactive shortfall of $175 billion created by this court decision. The U.S. Treasury now finds itself in a terrifying dead end, forced to finance this colossal repayment in a global environment where the appetite for debt securities, the famous treasuries, is already severely compromised and sensitive. It is mathematically impossible to fix this structural flaw without causing irreversible systemic damage to global stability. If the government simply refuses to pay this billion-dollar bill to importers, it completely destroys the rule of law and provokes an immediate and violent flight of foreign capital. On the other hand, if it decides to honor these retroactive repayments, it will have to issue an absurd amount of new debt, brutally accelerating the implosion of the national currency itself in an endless, vicious cycle. Think of this situation as a system of communicating vessels, where the internal pressure has far exceeded the critical safety limit of the pipes. Market liquidity acts like the water flowing through these rusty pipes of the fiat economy. By trying to print more money or issue new bonds to cover this deficit of $175 billion, the central bank will only be injecting more pressure into pipes that are already leaking on all sides. Like dominoes falling in a meticulously calculated sequence for destruction, each new debt issuance lethally erodes the purchasing power of your hard-earned money, destabilizing the foundations of global trade. The state printing machine is no longer a tool for economic salvation. It has become the main mechanism that ensures the evaporation of liquidity and imminent financial ruin. While the dollar's core structure crumbles under the weight of its own bureaucratic contradictions, a fascinating and dangerous technical distortion is quietly occurring in the precious metals market. Silver, specifically, has been strategically classified by authorities as a critical mineral for national security and modern technological development. Because of this exceptional bureaucratic designation, silver manages to entirely escape the new, punitive 15% global tariffs imposed by the desperate invocation of Section 122. This regulatory loophole has created a massive escape route invisible to the average investor, a pressure relief valve where large institutional capital is secretly positioning itself. Fiduciary illusion blinds most, but insiders know perfectly well that tangible, industrially useful assets are the last lifeboat on the contemporary financial Titanic. This tax exemption on silver generates a brutal double shock throughout the global supply chain, activating a veritable systemic trap for the unwary. On one hand, giant industries are desperately rushing to stockpile physical silver as quickly as possible, using it as a cheap anchor to escape the inevitable explosion in the costs of other tariffed industrial inputs. On the other hand, terrified fiat capital, aware that the traditional system is on the verge of multiple organ failure, rushes towards the same metal seeking an indestructible safe haven against the insanity of issuing state currency. The simultaneous pressure of corporate demand and protection against systemic inflation transforms silver into an asset with an irresistible gravitational magnetism for smart money fleeing the paper storm of the corrupt global financial market. The harsh and unforgiving mechanical reality of this equation is that the available physical supply simply doesn't have the capacity to sustain this overwhelming demand pressure for long. Official inventories recorded in the COMEX vaults have been showing an alarming freefall since the beginning of 2026, demonstrating that scarcity is not a theory, but an undeniable statistical fact. There is not enough physical silver on the planet to simultaneously satisfy the voracious tariff-free industry and the systemic panic of institutional investors desperately seeking protection. When this structural imbalance finally breaks through the barrier of the paper contract market, we will witness an instant depletion of physical inventory. The security of paper is nothing more than an accounting mirage. When the big players demand the actual delivery of the metal, the system will collapse under its own weight. Financial history makes no mistakes. It mercilessly punishes the arrogant who ignore its mathematical cycles of destruction. What you are witnessing now with this legal fracture and the 150-day clock is not an isolated and unprecedented event, but the exact and terrifying mirror image of the infamous Nixon shock that occurred in the emblematic year of 1971. In that dark time, the United States faced a death spiral forged by severe deficits, suffocating inflation, and a relentless drain on its physical gold reserves, exactly like the trillion-dollar hole that corrodes the Treasury today. The behavioral patterns of the collapsing state are absolutely identical and predictable for those who know how to decipher them. Those who blindly believed the government's reassuring narratives at that time, ignoring the systemic storm brewing on the horizon, were caught off guard and ended up losing absolutely everything in the subsequent evaporation of liquidity. In a single, fateful weekend, cornered by the brutal mathematics of insolvency and the irreversible loss of traditional economic tools, President Nixon shocked the entire planet. He imposed an abrupt 10% import surcharge and definitively cut the dollar's convertibility to gold, destroying the Bretton Woods Agreement. Analyze the structural architecture of this move, and you will see the exact systemic trap closing in again around you. The Supreme Court disarmed us, and the desperate invocation of Section 122 to suddenly impose 15% tariffs is a surgical repetition of that same drastic and improvised executive maneuver. The system acts with the same institutional desperation, trying to staunch an arterial hemorrhage with a simple palliative bandage. History proves, with relentless mathematical cruelty, that political decisions based on state panic always precipitate the structural collapse they were trying to avoid. The equation of ruin follows a strict and inevitable temporal logic. First, an unsustainable deficit rots the financial system from within. Then, there is the sudden and humiliating loss of crucial governmental economic tools. This forces an executive measure purely based on short-term desperation. And finally, we witness a global and unrestrained flight of capital to tangible and secure assets. It was precisely this catastrophic sequence of falling dominoes that decimated the purchasing power of the average citizen during the tragic inflationary decades that followed 1971. That generation trusted the empty word of the monetary authorities and ended up devoured by a silent death spiral that destroyed their hard-earned wealth. The elite who understood the mechanical implosion of the system quickly positioned themselves in precious metals, making incalculable fortunes, while the vast and ignorant majority of people suffered paralyzing misery. However, there is a colossal and staggering difference between that traumatic moment in the past and the systemic trap that ensnares us today, and it is precisely this obscure detail that the mainstream media deliberately hides from you. In the 1971 crash, the experiment of the trust-based fiduciary financial system was just being born, breathing its first moments of artificial life, with vast limits of expansion still unexplored by government bureaucracy. Today, however, the monumental structure of global fiduciary credit has reached its absolute and terminal mathematical exhaustion. The machine for issuing empty guarantees has permanently choked on a debt that already surpasses the very capacity of human comprehension, making any miracle of monetary policy impossible. The historical parallels are crystal clear and irrefutable, serving as a final warning sign on the road, alerting that the abyss is approaching at high speed. The final collapse is structural. Don't fall for the sweet illusion that the central bank or the suited bureaucrats of the National Treasury will ride across the horizon to save the day at the last second. The painful and undeniable truth is that global financial institutions are completely paralyzed, inexorably trapped in a systemic trap with no possibility of escape. The traditional system finds itself between a rock and a hard place, confronted by a nightmarish scenario where any and all state intervention will inevitably result in a disaster of epic proportions. The fiduciary mechanism has broken at its deepest core, and there are no more magic rabbits to be pulled from the hat of expansionary monetary policies. If the government tries to intervene aggressively to rescue liquidity and cover the trillion-dollar hole, it will only throw gasoline on the fire of collapse, accelerating the death spiral in a completely uncontrollable way. Pay close attention to the mathematical monstrosity of this seemingly unsolvable problem. To honor the $175 billion in tariff refunds mandated by the Supreme Court, the state will be brutally forced to monetize even more debt in an already saturated and utterly distrustful global market. Should they choose the path of rampant money printing to stem this bleeding, we will face the immediate detonation of uncontrollable systemic inflation, wiping the purchasing power of the middle class off the financial map. It is the pure and simple evaporation of real liquidity, replaced by paper money without any backing. On the other hand, if the authorities decide to technically default and deny these legally required payments, they will tear up the rule of law in public. This will provoke widespread panic among international investors and a devastating exodus of capital. As if this fiscal storm weren't absurdly lethal enough on its own, add to that the highly explosive geopolitical countdown in the Middle East. The American government has issued a maddening 10 to 15-day ultimatum for Iran to sign a restrictive nuclear agreement, openly flirting with the real possibility of targeted attacks on enrichment facilities. Big financial corporations know the system doesn't have the stamina to fight an external war and contain an internal collapse simultaneously. The panic behind the scenes is so dense you could cut it with a knife. When the first missiles fly or when the ultimatum deadline expires disastrously, the inevitable government response will be the imposition of severe capital controls to prevent capital flight. Your hard-earned money will suddenly be trapped inside the gilded cage of failed institutions. Never forget, under any circumstances, the ominous 150-day clock activated by the invocation of Section 122 of the Trade Act. This obscure bureaucratic device is definitive proof that government measures are mere desperate patches placed on the carcass of a ship sinking at high speed. When this short deadline irrevocably expires and the deeply polarized Congress fails to reach a saving agreement, the institutional implosion will be absolutely official and unquestionable. Any clumsy attempt to postpone the deadline will only consolidate the absolute legal uncertainty, forcing trading partners and giant creditors to massively liquidate their dollar-backed assets in the global market. The system cannot save itself this time because the same fiscal tools used to mask the disaster in the past have become the triggers of destruction. The bitter and lonely logical conclusion is that you are completely alone in the midst of this deadly storm, and there will be no government rescue. Large corporations, far from operating as pillars of economic stability, will act as voracious predators, monopolizing the meager tangible assets available to ensure their own corporate survival and abandoning retail to its own financial fate. The mainstream media will continue injecting the opium of normalcy and unrealistic optimism while the systemic trap slowly closes in on your family's finances and future. Smart money, silent whales, and true geopolitical insiders have already understood that the paper market has entered irreversible metastasis and are silently moving towards extreme physical safety. There is no hope within the labyrinth of corrupt state rules, as they were designed precisely to sacrifice your assets. The crucial moment has arrived to abandon the paralysis of fear and adopt a tactical stance of relentless empowerment against this systemic trap. While the hypnotized masses passively await the Iranian ultimatum and the 150-day tariff clock, smart money has already begun its silent and aggressive escape. Its first asymmetrical move of absolute defense is the immediate acquisition of physical gold the only asset shielded against counterparty risk and the evaporation of state liquidity. Don't be fooled by the artificial short-term volatility that the media propagates to scare amateurs. Global financial institutions have already understood the mathematics of ruin and are accumulating stocks at a desperate pace. Understand this definitively. The current level of $5,100 per ounce is not a speculative ceiling, but the new and unbreakable floor of global systemic repricing. Their second move is a surgical and devastating attack focused purely on physical silver and its closely related mining assets. It is precisely here that the greatest and most brutal wealth asymmetry of our generation resides. With the historical gold-to-silver ratio hovering around the 60 and demonstrating an incredibly violent compression trend, silver is trading for mere structural pennies. As a critical tax-exempt mineral, it has become a mandatory utility asset that the Treasury simply cannot print on its failing machines to cover that $175 billion government hole. Large industrial corporations are ferociously devouring all available stock on the market to ensure their own operational survival. Whoever positions themselves now, before the final implosion of paper, will capture an unparalleled generational wealth transfer. The third and decisive counterflow strategy is the complete and immediate debanking of a critical portion of your liquid capital, escaping regulatory clutches. The explosive convergence between the geopolitical ultimatum, the legal breakdown in the Supreme Court, and the evaporation of liquidity definitively proves that the current market volatility is not a passing financial miscalculation. It is, in fact, the rotten system readjusting its prices to a completely new legal and geopolitical reality, where the government will act as a predator to confiscate what little remains. You need to remove your assets from the reach of institutional freezes and the cyber risk inherent in the failed system, physically allocating them outside the country or in private vaults, independent of state jurisdiction. This surgical separation between your tangible assets and the fiduciary digital illusion is the only mathematical guarantee of intact financial survival. The perfect storm we've just dissected isn't an isolated event that will magically dissipate with time or false government promises. The evaporation of liquidity and the implosion of traditional bureaucratic structures demand that you maintain absolute and uninterrupted vigilance over the movements of smart money. The geopolitical chessboard is being reconfigured at this very moment, and the dominoes will continue to fall relentlessly in the coming months, crushing the assets of the unwary who trust traditional media. That's precisely why this space isn't just an ordinary video channel, but a strategic and continuous intelligence hub designed to keep you one step ahead of the financial catastrophe. If you close this tab and return to the comforting anesthesia of conventional daily news, you'll be blindly and independently walking straight to the system's slaughterhouse. You can't afford to face this systemic trap without a radar calibrated to detect state lies and the hidden maneuvers of the global market. Subscribe to this channel immediately and activate all notifications to ensure you receive our real-time tactical alerts whenever a new structural fracture is exposed. We will continue to relentlessly monitor the U.S. Treasury's 150-day clock and the explosive countdown in the Middle East, translating every obscure bureaucratic move into actionable protection strategies for your portfolio. By joining our community of financial sentinels, you cease to be easy prey for the failed fiat system and become part of a minority elite that understands exactly how to profit during the collapse. Insider information and cold technical analysis are the only real shields against the impending death spiral. Don't make the fatal mistake of believing that mainstream news will sound the alarm when the final collapse of the currency and markets finally and undeniably materializes. They are handsomely paid to keep the masses docile, ensuring that retail serves as an exit liquidity source for institutional sharks during the evaporation of liquidity. Our mission here is to tear away this veil of systemic illusions and deliver the harsh, raw reality of the facts, whatever the cost, whoever it hurts. Each new video we publish is a fundamental piece in the puzzle of your economic survival and the absolute protection of your family's assets against confiscation disguised as inflation. Your commitment to mathematical truth and asymmetric positioning must be renewed daily, and we will be your beacon of sanity in the midst of this ocean of state manipulation and financial ruin. Now, I need you to take a deep look at your own financial reality and answer something extremely important in the comments below. Knowing that the American government has just lost legal control over global trade and that physical silver has become the escape valve for large institutional capital, what percentage of your assets are still held hostage by the illusion of the traditional banking system? Have you already started your transition process to tangible and real assets? Or are you still paralyzed by fear, holding on to painted paper that loses value with every passing second on the clock of public debt? Be brutally honest with yourself and share your strategy or your biggest challenge with our community of engaged members. We read and analyze each comment to guide our next in-depth investigations and urgent geopolitical reports. The debate we're having here in the comments is the foundation of our collective intelligence against the silent tyranny of the central bank and the incompetence of the current rule of law. While the herd marches toward the financial precipice, guided by empty headlines and sterile political promises, we will stand firm, deciphering the mechanics of the collapse and accumulating real assets out of the clutches of the corrupt system. Always remember that true knowledge only has absolute value when it is immediately transformed into relentless protective action, before the institutional exit door is locked forever by panicked authorities. Strengthen your structural defenses today, tirelessly protect the people you love, and keep your eyes open for the inevitable storm that is already darkening the global economic horizon. We'll see you soon on the front lines of the next and imminent repricing of the world market.